Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Lopez, and I'm the Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work we've done on the nation's Latino population, both some of the demographics about the population and some important demographic trends, but also some of the characteristics of the population that we see emerging as the nation's Latino population changes. I am at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. And at the Pew Research Center, it's important to keep in mind some things about the center as I do my presentation. First, we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. Our work is funded primarily by the Pew Charitable Trusts. And if you have any questions about the center, certainly feel free to reach out to me. I'll have some contact information at the end. But again, it's important to note that we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. Now, speaking of U.S. Latinos, when you take a look at the nation's Hispanic population, that population today stands at nearly 61 million people. That's as of 2019. But you can see that the population of Hispanics has grown rapidly over the course of the last 5 decades. Back in 1970, there were about 10 million people who identified as Hispanic or Latino in the United States then. Today, those numbers are almost at 61 million, and the 2020 census is going to probably reveal a population of perhaps 62 million Latinos living in the United States, making up about 18.5% of the US population. What's striking about the nation's Hispanic population and its demographics is how important it has been to national demographics and national population growth. For example, since 2010, Latinos have accounted for half of the nation's population growth. And this has really been an important trend that we've seen at least since the 1990s, where Latinos have played an important role in shaping US demographics, but also population growth at the state level. You can also see that Latino population growth is outpacing every other racial and ethnic group, at least in absolute numbers, since 2010. You can also see as well that the nation's Hispanic population is not just about its traditional population centers in Texas, California, Florida, New York, or Chicago, but instead it's a population that is dispersed across the country. And there are Hispanic population communities, or Hispanic communities, I'm sorry, in just about every part of the country. So you can see this in the upper Midwest. You can see it in places like Eastern Washington State, particularly in the South is where we've seen some rapid Hispanic population growth since the 1990s. But the story of Hispanic population demography has been one not only of fast growth, but also of dispersion across the nation. Speaking of that dispersion, as you take a look at the states and where the Hispanic population is growing fastest, you can see that the states where it is growing fastest are actually in the upper Midwest. North Dakota and South Dakota have led in Hispanic population growth since 2010, largely because of opportunities, economic opportunities associated with energy production, and also largely because of opportunities in agriculture in many parts of the upper Midwest. This is not unique to Latinos. You see other groups like white non-Hispanics, for example, Blacks and Asians also moving to the Dakotas because of economic opportunity. But for Latinos, these have been the fastest growing Hispanic populations. Small, but the fastest growing over the course of the last decade. When you also take a look at the Latino population, another important demographic characteristic is how young it is. The median age for Latinos is 30. Whereas by comparison, the median age for non-Hispanic whites is 46. That difference in ages really is striking, particularly when you look at how many young Latinos there are under the age of 18. But just generally speaking, more than half of the nation's Hispanic populations are part of the millennial generation or younger. And that's particularly striking when you take a look at it by nativity. The nation's Hispanic population by nativity is really quite interesting. About a third of all Latinos are immigrants, but most are US born. And those US borns are generally under the age of 20. So when you talk about the nation's demographic future, that demographic future is going to be driven more so by US born Latinos, the education they get, how they enter the job market, the careers they have, more so than the arrival of new immigrants, which, by the way, immigration from Latin America has slowed sharply in the last 10 years, even with the arrival of many asylum seekers from Central America and people from Venezuela who have left Venezuela amid economic crisis. But when you take a look at the US Hispanic population, it is the US born who are its main drivers of growth. What about where Latinos trace their roots to? One important characteristic of the population is how diverse it is, and it's diverse on many dimensions, but one key one is where people trace their ancestry. At the national level, Mexican origin Hispanics make up the single largest group of the population, about 62% of the population. They're followed by Puerto Ricans, who make up about 10%, Cubans and Salvadorans, who make up about 4% each. And then, of course, there are many other groups below that with representation from all of Latin America present among the nation's Hispanic population. However, this diversity varies sharply across the country, particularly on the East Coast. And here are key metropolitan areas, large metropolitan areas with significant Hispanic populations. But you can see that the origins, the combination of origins for Hispanics in each of these locations varies. And for example, in Los Angeles or in Houston, it's Mexican origin Hispanics who are the single largest group, followed by Salvadorans among Hispanics in those places. But when you take a look at a place, for example, like Miami, it is Cubans who are the largest origin group. Or the New York City metropolitan area, Dominicans and Puerto Ricans together make up about a quarter each of the population of Hispanics there. And when you look at Washington, D.C., it's Salvadorans who are the single largest group. But it's important to note that this diversity varies widely across the country, and there are different stories about how those populations came to those locations and what it means to be of different Hispanic origins in those places. So that's, I think, an important point to keep in mind when you think about the diversity of the population. There are some important trends as well that I want to talk about with regards to US Hispanics. First, growth rates. The Hispanic population is fast growing. As I showed you earlier, Latinos have accounted for more than half of the nation's population growth since 2010. However, the population growth of Latinos is slowing because of fewer immigrants coming from Latin America, and also as fertility rates among Hispanic women begin to look more like those for US women, generally speaking. So fertility rates are declining as well. And you can see that here in terms of annual growth rates for the Hispanic population. Spanish. Spanish use is an important part of what it means to be Latino in the United States. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. And there are maybe about 39 million Latinos who speak Spanish at home. So Spanish is spoken by about almost 71% of US Latinos say they speak Spanish at home. But I think that what's interesting also to note is that that share that speaks Spanish at home is declining. And we're seeing a growing number who are English proficient. This is partly being driven by US-born Latinos who are now largely growing up in an English only household, or a household where only English is spoken. And while many parents teach Spanish to their children, it isn't necessarily the case that the children are learning Spanish through the instruction they get from their parents at home. But when you take a look at among Latino adults, the share who are Spanish dominant, who are bilingual, or who are English dominant, all measures of proficiency in each one of these languages, you'll see that generally speaking, Latinos are distributed across these three categories fairly evenly, at least among adults. But it varies widely across immigrant generations. For example, when you take a look at immigrant Latinos, you'll find that more than half are Spanish dominant. Perhaps that's no surprise given that they arrived in the United States predominantly speaking Spanish and not necessarily English. But their US-born children, the second generation, are more likely to be bilingual, and it is the third and higher generation, people who are the US-born children of US-born parents. They are more likely to be English dominant. And it is that last group, this third and higher generation group, which is going to make up a large part of population growth and change for the Hispanic population as we move through the rest of this century. One other important trend to keep in mind is the rising educational attainment of the group. Greater number of young Latinos are attending college than ever. High school dropout rate for Hispanics is now at near record lows, and now much like whites and blacks. And also, when you take a look at the share that are finishing college, today about 1 in 5 Latinos ages 25 to 29 have completed a bachelor's degree. That's up from what it had been about 10 years ago. Even so, it still remains behind what you see for whites, blacks, and Asian Americans. But it's important to note that a lot of this change is coming from young Hispanic women who are leading this change and who are more likely to be getting their college degrees than young Hispanic men. But both groups have seen a rise in the share with a bachelor's degree over the last 10 years. When you take a look at one other very interesting characteristic of this population, that is intermarriage. And the nation's Hispanic population has one of the highest intermarriage rates of any major racial or ethnic group in the United States today. About a quarter of all Latino newlyweds marry somebody who is not Latino. And when you look at intermarried couples, you'll find that 42% are a white spouse living with or married to a Hispanic spouse. That's actually more common than a white spouse with an Asian spouse, or a white spouse with a black spouse, or any other combination. So when you talk about intermarriage, Latinos are among the most likely to be intermarried and most likely to, among newlyweds at least, have one of the highest intermarriage rates. All again, very important points to keep in mind when we think about how they see their identity, because that identity is changing as the generations change. One other thing I think to keep in mind is income. Hispanic income, household income, has generally lagged that of other groups. But since the Great Recession, we've seen an increase in Hispanic household incomes. According to the Census Bureau, Hispanic median household income is now over $50,000, at least as of 2019. So keep in mind, this is prior to the COVID-19 recession. Even so, Latinos continue to lag others, and I think it's important to keep in mind that Hispanic households tend to also be larger than households for other groups. So it's important to keep in mind that despite this rising income, the relative size of those households could mean differences in terms of how well people are able to provide for themselves. Some other notable trends to keep in mind. Did you know that the number of Latino elected officials is now over 6,000, almost 7,000 elected officials as of 2018, according to the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. But in addition, that number is almost double what it was in 1996. So more Hispanics are getting elected to public office than ever, but they still make up less than 5% of all elected officials nationwide. When it comes to purchasing power, it's interesting to take a look at how much purchasing power or how big the Latino economy is. And here, some work from the Latino Donor Collaborative in Los Angeles has puts the Latino economy at about $2.6 trillion. That makes up about 13% of the US economy overall. When we talk about household wealth, median net worth for Hispanic households remains below what it is for other groups. For example, the median net worth for Hispanics is about $20,000, whereas for white non-Hispanics, that median net worth is more along the lines of about $170,000. The Great Recession has also had a big impact on Latino wealth, and Latinos still haven't recovered from the Great Recession and the wealth hit that they took then. And finally, when you take a look at small businesses, there are about 4 million Latino small businesses in the United States today. Most are single contractors, so it's oftentimes businesses without employees. But it's interesting to note that Latinos are the majority of new businesses that are created in the United States, at least over the course of the last few years. How COVID-19 might impact that remains to be seen, but Latinos have been an important part of the small business story in the United States for a while now. I finally want to talk about Latinos and identity, how they see their own identity and the terms they use to describe themselves, because there are many different ways that the population describes its identity. First, though, what does it mean to be Hispanic? What are some of the key things that make somebody Hispanic? And do you have to have this characteristic in order to be considered part of the group? I want to stress that most of the work that the Census Bureau and the Pew Research Center does relies on people to self-report that they're part of the Hispanic or Latino or Latinx population in the United States. But when you take a look at asking, and you actually ask people directly, do you have to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic? Do you have to have a Spanish surname to be considered Hispanic? In both cases, our surveys over the years have shown no. The population of people in the United States who call themselves Hispanic or Latino say that you don't have to speak Spanish to be part of the group, nor do you have to have a Spanish surname to be a part of the group. We also have looked at the terms that Latinos use to describe themselves, whether or not it's their country of origin term, the term American, or Hispanic or Latino. We've also looked at Latinx, and I'm going to talk about Latinx in just a little bit. But when you take a look at the terms Latinos use, one of the most important characteristics or findings of our work has been that it's the country of origin term that matters most, or that's used most often, I should say, by the population. Mexican or Dominican or Cubana, for example, are the terms that people use. That's particularly true of immigrants, but you also see a significant number of third or higher generation Hispanics doing the same. But what you also see happening across the generations is the rise in the use of American as a term most often used to describe themselves. I would say as a side note for this work that the context of how the question about identity is asked will determine a lot about how somebody might respond to that question. So for example, a Latino to Latino, you're probably going to see people respond by saying that their country of origin term or the ancestry of their family is how they'll describe themselves. If it's a non-Latino to Latino, you're probably going to hear the Latino respond with a term like Hispanic or Latino or Latinx as the identity term. And if it's somebody from outside the United States speaking to somebody who's Latino, you might find that they're going to use the term American most often to describe themselves. So there's a lot of nuance in the way in which people describe their identity, and our survey work over the years has really shown this, particularly across the generations. We've also done some other work, though, to look at some other key important questions and identities that we see among US Latinos. For example, what share say they're Afro-Latino? About a quarter do, according to a 2014 survey that we did. And this is, I think, an important point to keep in mind that when you ask somebody about their identity, how you ask it can actually elicit different responses. And here, 1/4 say that they're Afro-Latino. But if you were to ask directly what their race is, only about 5% of US Latinos will say that they are Black. So asking specifically about Afro-Latinidad will matter a lot in whether or not people will respond and say, yes, I am part of that. We've also asked about what share are mixed race or mestizo or mulatto. And you can see here that about 34% say that they are of mixed race heritage. Again, this is very different than what you see in Census Bureau data from if you ask a race question directly about whether or not somebody is of multiple races. But again, it gets to the importance and the distinctiveness of the Latino experience in the US, that there are many ways that this population describes its identity, and there are many ways and many different answers that people will give depending on the context. Recently, we've done a survey of US Latino adults asking about the term Latinx. If you've been following the use of the term has grown in popularity and use, particularly among news organizations, universities. You see it used a lot more by celebrities, and also you see it being used by corporations, in addition to many arts organizations. The term Latinx, however, is a term that is largely unknown among the nation's Hispanic population. Now, this is a population of people who self-identify as part of being Hispanic or Latino. And we asked in our survey in December whether or not they'd even heard of the term. And we found that 3/4 say that no, they haven't heard of the term Latinx. And if they have heard of the term, relatively few actually use it to describe their own identity. Only about 3% of all US Latino adults say they use Latinx to describe themselves. It's important to note that this is a survey result, which is about awareness of the term and use of the term. We didn't ask people whether or not they liked the term or not. That's not what this result is about. But Latinx is a relatively unknown term among the population it's meant to describe. We also did ask about whether or not people prefer Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, or perhaps some other pan-ethnic term to describe the US population of people who trace their roots to Latin America and Spain. And we found that 61% of adults say that they prefer the term Hispanic. That's followed by about 30% who say Latino, and just 4% who say Latinx is a term they prefer to describe the US population of people who trace their roots to Latin America. That's really striking because across every demographic group we looked at, and you can see all the demographic groups here, Hispanic is by far the preferred term when it comes to choosing a pan-ethnic term. We've seen a similar result like this over the course of the last 20 years of polling at the Pew Research Center of the US Hispanic population, by the way. And I think that's another important factor to keep in mind. I want to end by sharing with you some findings from the National Endowment for the Arts survey of participation in the arts. And this is from 2017. But you can see that 41% of US Hispanic adults say that they've participated in some sort of artistic, creative, or cultural activity in the year prior to the survey. That's lower than what you see for some other groups. And it's a number that it's hard to compare to the past, since the survey has changed how it asks about these activities over the years. Even so, about 4 in 10 Latino adults say that they have attended some sort of cultural event over the course of the year prior to the survey. I'm going to end there. You can find all of our work at pewresearch.org. And of course, you can also find more work by following us either on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. You can also follow me on my personal Twitter account as well. It's Hugo Lopez. But anything you'd like to know, or if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Mark, thank you for that incredible presentation. It was so informative. And of course, it brings questions to mind, especially how do we connect the research to practice? In the order of your presentation, I was fascinated by the information about the age of the Hispanic population and how young the Hispanic population is in this country. You used 30 years versus 46 years. It's a remarkable difference, which tells me that what we are experiencing right now as a growing audience, a growing potential audience, will only grow larger, because as this population comes into its prime attendance years still down the road, there is a growing opportunity to build audience among the Hispanic population. Is that how you see it?
Yes, in fact, if you just take a look at the characteristics of those who say, for example, are in kindergarten, about 25% of kindergartners nationwide are Latino, and there are many states where more than 1 in 5 kindergartners are Latino. But that's really the demographic future of the country. So over the next 20 plus years, Latinos and their share of the population will grow from 18.5% today to maybe about a quarter of the population at some point in 2 or 3 decades from now. So when you look at the demographics, yeah, this is a population that's growing and is yet to reach those years where, as you noted, they will be in their prime cultural arts going years. They'll be in their prime earning years as well in a couple of decades.
Yeah, so now really is a time to think about how we work with and engage with this important audience, which then brought me to the, I confess, surprising realization about what you report as a diminishing use of Spanish as the dominant language among the Hispanic population. And I apologize for thinking that it might be a growing use of Spanish as opposed to a diminishing use of Spanish. But a lot of our opera companies have been investing in Spanish language projected translations in the theater or some bilingual performance programs. And I'm wondering whether we are, in fact, somehow missing the boat here, and that we should be focusing on, English as the way we produce our performance programs, or indeed whether we are displaying sensitivity and accessibility in providing Spanish language translation. How does that cut given the data?
So when you take a look at the use of Spanish, as I noted, about 39 million Latinos speak Spanish at home. I want to stress, though, that speaking Spanish at home isn't necessarily a formally trained Spanish. In fact, oftentimes it's something where people learn to speak Spanish at home, and it's sort of what you might call the household Spanish. So when you think about how you might reach that population, it's oftentimes in a conversational way that you might be able to reach it, as opposed to a more formal business or professional Spanish kind of way. The other thing I think that's important to note is that the biggest driver of Spanish use among Latinos has been the arrival of new immigrants. But since the Great Recession, and it's been 10 years now, we've seen significantly fewer numbers of new immigrant arrivals arrive from Latin America. So much so that I don't know if the audience is aware of this, but Mexico, which used to be the primary source of immigrants, is no longer the primary source for the country. It's actually Chinese and Indian migrants who are a bigger part of that story now than Mexicans. But as we get farther away from those big immigration years, English use is going to rise, particularly among those who are foreign born. And you're going to start to see a lot of US born young people who grew up in a household where only English is spoken enter adulthood. They may want to learn Spanish at some point, but I think that reaching out to the population in English, you're going to see as something that might be an effective way to reach many, particularly younger Latinos. But I wouldn't diminish the importance of Spanish. Many are bilingual. Many of those who are US born of immigrant parents particularly are bilingual and are proficient in both languages is enough to be able to navigate the world in either English or Spanish. So we're still in an inflection point, I think.
Very interesting. And of course, you refer to labels and the more common use of Hispanic as a label. And of course, here we have a session that is about the Latinx voice in opera. So duly noted, one always learns from research here. but it is, one wants to be respectful in speaking to a group of people we wish to, we hope that they feel at home in our opera companies, and that it's a place where we are knowledgeable and welcoming, and where everyone can belong. So would you suggest that labels are important, and that in fact Hispanic is the label that would be best used by our companies?
It's a great question. I would first note, though, that the use or the preference for any term, whether Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx, but particularly Hispanic or Latino, can vary widely across the country. So any particular company might want to think about what the dynamics are in their location. So to give you an example, in Texas, Hispanic is by far the preferred term over Latino. There's no doubt. Even if people have no preference, it's a much lower share that say they have no preference for either term compared with Hispanic. But if you look at a place like California, Latino and also, frankly, Latinx is going to be more commonly used there. And if you look at New York City, you're going to hear Latino used more often than, say, Hispanic. But again, it depends on the location, and it depends on the particular dynamics of the origin groups and populations in those places. So one needs to do a little bit of work to figure this out. But I think that to be respectful, and if you wanted to follow the lead, say, of congressional representatives, in their tweets in recent years, you've seen them use Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx, oftentimes in the same amount of ways in terms of Hispanic or Latino, the same number of uses, but now just adding Latinx as an additional term. That's something that I'm seeing a lot of folks use, which is to say that they try to use all of them to be respectful of all the different ways that people might use those terms. One additional piece of data from our report. In the follow-up to the question of, have you heard of the term Latinx? If somebody said that they had, we then asked, what does the term mean to you? And it was an open-ended question. 42% said that the term to them is a gender-neutral term, and that's really what the term is about. It's part of having a term that's inclusive of many different people, of many different gender identities. But many Spanish speakers and many immigrants had the following comments in the open-ended question. Latinx just doesn't work in Spanish. How do you pronounce Latin with an X? Also, there was a sense that it was a term that was being placed on the population by English speakers, and that this is yet another example of a U.S. imposition of an identity that, frankly, most of Latin America doesn't identify with. Some might even have called it colonial or imperialistic. Now, these are all conversations that have been happening lately around Latinx. In the press, you'll see many conversations about this. But I want to also say that Latinx is part of a broader international movement towards gender inclusive terms. It's not the only one even for the Latino population in the world. In Latin America, Latin E, so imagine Latin with an E, has become an alternative to Latinx. So who knows, Latinx might actually even be supplanted in the United States by something that frankly comes from the Spanish speaking world. And it remains to be seen how that will happen, if it will even happen.
And what this underscores, and it's a phrase that we use all the time, is the importance of listening to learn. That one cannot make assumptions. One has to figure out what is right in your own company, in your neighborhood, in your community, in your city, and that one answer in this vast country does not in any way suffice. And it was your pointing out the work that's needed to figure out what's right in your city. How does one do that work? And is it individual surveys that an opera company might do of its audience, but of course its audience isn't its potential audience? Does every city have resources that we need to identify and make available to our members? Are there national sources for this at Pew or elsewhere where our members can really learn about this in order to get it right?
When you take a look at the landscape of organizations around the country that help Hispanic or Latino populations, you'll find, for example, that the number of organizations will differ depending on how long the Latino population has been in those places. So a place like Los Angeles or New York City will be very rich in the number of organizations that are available. Some will be even very origin specific, like a Puerto Rican origin group in New York City. Some may even be about connections to the home country as a hometown association, like among Dominicans, say in the Boston area. But when you take a look at places that have newer populations, like say Minnesota or North Dakota, as I talked about earlier, there will be less of that infrastructure available. So any company that might want to engage with the local leadership might find it a little bit harder in some places like Tennessee, as opposed to, say, Los Angeles. But to do this research, a lot of it can be done in a number of ways. It can be done just by asking, either through a survey or perhaps even through focus groups. We've found that focus groups around the country can be one of the most important ways to see the big trends. And while it's just anecdotal evidence, those big trends emerge out of the focus groups. So that might be one less expensive way to and quicker way to get some read on this, rather than trying to do public opinion surveys like we do nationally. But again, I think that the important thing to note here is that there are organizations and community leadership groups emerging everywhere around the country. It just depends on where you are, how many there might be. An important resource might actually be, for example, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce.
I was
That's
just going to
oftentimes
suggest that. Yeah.
one of the groups that you will see present early on in many places, in addition to many, say, immigrant rights groups in places like Georgia.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. You have provided such interesting information, raised important questions, and pointed out the responsibility we all have to listen, to learn, to do the research, not to make assumptions, and to do our best to adjust as we learn to get it right. So, Mark, thank you for getting our discussion this week going so brilliantly. We really appreciate all your work, all the work of Pew. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.